Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we have several developments in favor of the Russians, both in the north and the Kursk region, to the south of Kupyansk, in the direction of Toretsk, within the Pokrovsk first line of defense where the offensive operations continue, and in the direction of Velyka Novosilka. Starting out in the north, the Russians have managed to recapture Pokrovsk in its entirety, the fortified positions, the first patches. They've also managed to cross over the Sel River and reach the outskirts of Guevo, which they are currently storming. With this, the Russians have moved on beyond the Sel River and they are flanking Sucha from the south. A combined assault by the Russians towards Velykovo in the west and Sucha from the south would cut off all supplies for the Ukrainians in the southern direction and into the Kursk region. This means that the current offensive operations by the Russians from the Lyubimovka direction in the north and from the Pokrovsk direction in the south could potentially encircle the Ukrainian forces in their Kursk incursion. This would require additional Ukrainian reinforcements being sent to defend against this offensive operation, or a relocation from the front line and a withdrawal from those positions towards Sucha to strengthen their defenses in the area. Otherwise, the Russians can push through. The Russians can, with the concentration of heavy firepower through FAB bombs, heavily demolish Sucha, and in that process be able to flank the Ukrainian positions through the west and the south. Moving on to the Kupyansk direction, the Russians have managed to advance in the direction of the settlement of Zeleny High, which is to the west of Vishnevik, covering a large area north of the settlement. And with this advance, the Russians are developing offensive operations further in the direction of Borova, advancing from the eastern direction towards Borova and from the northern direction towards Borova, as we have seen with the recent advances throughout the past few weeks. It is likely based on the direction of advances by the Russians that they are looking to gain control over Zeleny High, push towards Borivka and Drivka, and flank the fortified positions from the south. With a combined strike from the northern and southern direction, they'll be able to capture the first line of defense and then move on to the second line of defense, where they can flank continuously the first line of defense from the north to gain control over the entirety of it, to then prepare a similar operation where they'll break through one of the two directions and then flank the second direction, where they will have to break through one of the sides in a head-on assault, after which they can gain control over the rest of the sides through positional fighting and flanking maneuvers. Topographically, we can see that Zeleny High is located on the high ground and the following settlements are all located on the low ground. This means an advance from the east towards the west would be a downhill battle and the Russians would have the height advantage, while from the northern direction it is all located in the low ground. This means it's more difficult to pass through there, and this is why the main push of the Russians is coming from the eastern direction, with control over the three settlements along the high ground, from Kupyansk in the south to Vishneva in the north. The Russians are in a position where they can continue advancing along the high ground through the fortified positions, flanking the northern direction and combining their forces towards Borova to cut off yet another crossing here in the Oskar River direction. Moving on to the Toretsk direction, there's been further advances by the Russians near the industrial zone and the hills to the south of it, where the Russians have managed to gain a foothold in the residential area to the west of the industrial zone, advancing further towards an encirclement of the industrial zone here in the central parts of Toretsk. Again, gaining control over the apartment complex area and the industrial zone will allow the Russians to then start fighting over the western outskirts of Toretsk and to gain full control over the city, as well as to push towards the northern outskirts near Krimske to gain full control over that direction as well. In general, the Russian positions here in Toretsk has significantly improved with the recent offensive that started at the start of December, which has allowed to gain almost full control over the apartment complex area, flanking the industrial zone and capturing the hills in the south of Toretsk. In the Pokrovsk direction, significant offensive operations continue. The Russians have managed to reach the outskirts of Dashenske. This was geolocated with this footage here. At the same time, the Russians have managed to advance further along the railways, where they've managed to expand their foothold within Shevchenko and the settlement of Vytroshenia, where the Russians have now secured supply lines in and out of those settlements, as well as bypassed the Dragon Teeth fortifications south of them, which creates a crossing to resupply and to launch offensive operations. With this, the Russians are now fighting past the first line of defense and into the settlements themselves, which will then lead to the second line of defense, following which it will be an open road towards Pokrovsk itself. Continuing an advance along the railways will allow the Russians to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the second line of defense and allow the Russians to gain a foothold in the apartment complex area in the southern parts of Pokrovsk, to which the Russians can then start developing offensive operations to flank the city itself from the western direction and to prevent Ukrainian counterattacks towards the open fields, but turn it into urban warfare. The current situation is that the Russians continue offensive operations along the first line of defense and move towards the second line of defense in the Pokrovsk direction, with the recent offensive towards Pokrovsk having begun the Battle of Pokrovsk itself and started developing the offensive operations to an encirclement of the city and a storming of the city directly. Through this, the Russians are now fighting near Dashenske, Vytroshenia, Shevchenko, and also Toretsk, where the Russians have managed to capture the remaining parts of the eastern parts of the settlement and are flanking it from both the north and the eastern directions, while at the same time consolidating their gains south of Novopustinka and pushing towards the northern flank of Pushkine towards Novolenivka. With the road cut between Pokrovsk and Kurahove, it's likely that the Russians launch offensive operations from the northern direction to flank Kurahove on a wide flank towards Andrivka from the northern direction along the main highway. At the same time, we see continuous fighting in Kurahove itself and in Velyka Novosilka. We can see that the axis of attack of the Russian forces through the railways from Selidove and through towards Pokrovsk does not have the height advantage. Instead, the locations and the settlements of the Ukrainians have a height advantage of about 35 meters towards the settlement right here. And there's also the river line that moves through, which the Russians have to push through. However, with the foothold within the settlements along the river line and the settlements in the high ground to the north, the Russians are now contesting these high ground elevation areas. There's also the potential to gain control over the settlement, which will allow the Russians to develop offensive operations towards the city itself, where there is not any height advantage until reaching the central parts of the city or the eastern parts. Other than that, their positions here in the south will allow the Russians to develop offensive operations in that direction. Also allow the Russians to move along the river line to the south, where the Russians can establish a front line along it during the siege of Pokrovsk to concentrate their forces in a smaller area through a small contingent of troops along the entire river line, and then concentrating at one point towards Pokrovsk itself, making a crossing across the river line. We also see here in the western parts along the Kurahove-Dnipro road that goes through here, Kurahove in the southeast, along towards Andrivka and so on. It's also located along a river line located at the low ground at an elevation of 101 meters, where if the Russians move along the main highway from Pokrovsk in the north and then down south towards Andrivka, we can see that they'll have the high ground advantage throughout this whole process at a height advantage of about 60 to 70 meters, which is a significant height advantage, combined with assaults towards Sukhyar in the south and along the river line there, allowed the Russians to take control over the areas from the southern direction and cutting off at any point during the river line to cut off supplies of the Ukrainian forces in the southern parts of the Donetsk region, in the sense that the Russians can advance along their positions here east of Velyka Novosilka towards any point along the river line here south of Pokrovsk, west of Kurahove, either launching towards Oderatne in the northwest, towards Roslev directly to the north, or Selenivka in the east, combined with an assault towards either Andrivka in the center, Shevchenko in the east, or Selenye Kut in the west, where the Russians can advance along the fortified positions and the settlements to the north of these positions to cut off the connection between Pokrovsk and Velyka Novosilka, but also to gain control over the settlements in the area, where the Russians can then capture Zaporizhia. The settlement of Zaporizhia has no military or political significance. It's just funny that it has the same name as the region. So when the Russians capture this, I'll have a clickbait for the video. In the direction of Velyka Novosilka, the Russians have advanced towards the southern outskirts of the settlement, where they've captured the fortified positions of the Ukrainians south of it. And with this, the Russians are now threatening the Ukrainian positions along Neskushne, Storoshev, and Makarivka from the eastern direction. And with the recent advances in the western direction, we can expect more towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians west of Remivka to gain control over the Remevsky Ledge, south of Remivka and Velyka Novosilka. Combined with the fighting in the northern flank as well, the Ukrainian supply is limited, and the Russians will likely capture Velyka Novosilka within the coming weeks before the end of December, which will force a Ukrainian withdrawal to the defensive line northwest of Velyka Novosilka, following which the Russians will develop offensive operations along the border area between Zaporizhia, Dnipro, and Donetsk, while at the same time pushing towards flanking Kurakhove and moving up towards Pokrovsk, gaining full control over the highway connections and increasing the supply going towards Pokrovsk for the siege. The Russians will likely make use of the highway south of Donetsk through Marinka and Kurakhove to supply the southern flank of Pokrovsk, while at the same time having the direct supply through Avdiivka and Karelivka here in the central parts towards the Novorodivka and Seldova directions, and finally through the northern flank through Avdiivka to flank the Pokrovsk from the eastern direction, and all three flanks will be supplied through Donetsk towards Pokrovsk. After which the battle over the city itself and then offensive operations following that will begin. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.